Now, I don't mean to keep picking on VenomFangX, especially now that he's left YouTube, but in this clip from one of his videos, he summarizes the way that a lot of Christian fundamentalists feel about the canonical Gospels in the New Testament. You know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In this particular clip, he's addressing YouTube user GoGreen18 on the mistaken understanding that she believes in the non-canonical Gospel of Thomas. But that mistake isn't what's important. I'd like you to listen to the way that Venom characterizes the canonical Gospels in relation to an apocryphal one. A lot of people agree with his views.
Go Green, you made some claims about the New Testament. You said we can't trust it because it was written between 30 to 40 years after Jesus lived, died, and was resurrected, according to the Scriptures. Now, rather than trusting the New Testament as it is written by people who clearly knew Jesus, they lived with him, rather than trusting those, you would rather trust something called the Gospel of Thomas, which was clearly not written by Thomas because it was written around 140 AD. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are far more valid because they were written much sooner, much more contemporary to Jesus. So you didn't even apply your own criteria to your own beliefs. And instead of actually trusting what the disciples had to say about their master, who they knew personally, they lived with him, on top of that, in the book of Acts, it claims that the Holy Spirit was given to them on the day of Pentecost, which brought to remembrance everything that Jesus had said. You have rejected all of this in favor of a Gnostic heresy, a forgery, which was written much later.
So Venom believes that the canonical Gospels were clearly written by the disciples.
Rather than trusting the New Testament as it is written by people who clearly knew Jesus, by people who clearly knew Jesus, by people who clearly knew Jesus.
And he seems to have little patience for anyone who thinks otherwise. To state the obvious, if these miraculous stories were actually written firsthand by eyewitnesses, if Matthew wrote the book of Matthew, John the book of John, and so on, then these stories, while not really being extraordinary evidence, would at least have a much greater claim to credibility. If the disciples actually wrote these stories, then not only are believers justified in believing them, but they have a stronger case for insisting that you believe them too. The important thing is the widespread belief that the disciples' authorship of the canonical Gospels is obvious and shouldn't be disputed. But is it really that obvious? To me, and to a majority of Bible scholars, the idea that the canonical Gospels were written by the disciples isn't all that clear. For one thing, none of the Gospels are testimonial in character. None of them say things like, "I, the disciple Matthew, did witness these miracles with my own eyes." None of the Gospels makes an undisputed claim to be written by an eyewitness. To give just one example of this lack of clarity, I'd like to look at the book of Matthew, chapter 9, verse 9, that describes an episode widely known as the Calling of St. Matthew, an episode depicted here by Caravaggio's famous painting. In the King James translation, the verse reads, "And as Jesus passed forth from thence, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the receipt of custom," that is, a place in Judea where the taxes for the Roman Empire were collected. "And he saith unto him, Follow me. And he arose and followed him." Now, do you notice anything odd about this passage? Its purported author, the disciple Matthew, refers to himself in the third person. If he is indeed the author of this gospel, why does he do that? Now, some Bible defenders give explanations for why they feel that Matthew might have done this. He may have just been modest. He was also known by the Jewish name Levi, and by referring to himself by his Christian name, Matthew, he was proclaiming his Christian identity over his Jewish identity. Furthermore, in first century Judea, they didn't have the tradition of testimonial literature the way they had in later centuries and in other parts of the world. In other words, if you understood the historical context of first-century Judea, Matthew's authorship of the Gospel would be clear to you. Now, for all I know, the disciple Matthew may very well be the author of this Gospel. For all I know, there may be some very good reasons why his Gospel isn't testimonial in character and why he refers to himself in the third person. But at the end of the day, Matthew's authorship of the verse isn't at all obvious. And if Matthew didn't write this part of the book of Matthew, how do we know that he wrote any of it? So when it comes to issues like this, Bible defenders like VenomFangX are basically saying that if we want the inerrancy of the Bible to be clear to us, if we want to know why apparent contradictions in the Bible aren't in fact contradictions, then we need to become experts on the culture and customs of first-century Judea. So it looks like we have three choices. Either become an expert on the era, just accept what the Bible says without question, or go to hell. Why would an all-loving God, a God who's supposed to care about your salvation, put his human creations in such an unreasonable predicament?